You'll be shocked, but on a small island not far from the famous tourist city of Venice, people were once buried alive. In this video, I'll tell you why a beautiful island in Italy tops the list of the most terrifying and dangerous places in the world, how a regular artillery fort was turned into a psychiatric hospital, and why wheat was grown in the places of mass graves of people who died from the plague. And at the end of the video, you'll hear real reviews from eyewitnesses who have been to this eerie place. Enjoy watching. Today, Venice has become one of Italy's main tourist cities. Beautiful, well-kept streets, ancient architecture, a huge number of different canals, and a special atmosphere of man-made structures mixed with wild nature. Tourists come to Venice for this. Personally, I admire its beauty. But few know that not far from this wonderful city is perhaps the scariest and most dangerous island abandoned for hundreds of years. Poveglia, that's the name it bears now. It is believed to have been founded in the distant year of 421 AD. At least the first mentions date back to that time. Back then, it was inhabited by people, and it continued like this for many years. However, in 1379, the islanders were moved to other cities due to an attack by the Genoese fleet. And since then, the island has been completely abandoned. In 1645, the government built a special fortified artillery fort on the southern part of Poveglia Island. In those days, it was supposed to help defend against enemy attacks. As a result, for about 100 years, only soldiers who served there inhabited it. But after the island was handed over to the Venetian health authorities in 1776, horrifying things began to happen there. In 1793, this place was turned into a real isolation ward for sailors sailing to Venice. At that time, the bubonic plague was rampant throughout Italy, claiming millions of lives annually. And the government understood that sailors carrying this disease could infect the local residents of Venice, so they needed to be kept somewhere. The island was completely closed, and only certain medical workers and a few officials could access it. Since then, Poveglia has become a real branch of hell. People who ended up there were doomed to a painful death. The fact is that in the 18th century, there were no cures for the plague, and almost everyone died from it. And considering that all the inhabitants of the island were infected, healthy people simply had no chance of survival. Poveglia became the last refuge for anyone who ended up there. As I prepared this video for you, I came across horrifying footages of mass burials. At a shallow depth, the remains of dozens and hundreds of people, each of whom died from a monstrous disease, could be found. And it seems to me that the disease hasn't gone anywhere from there. As is known, the bubonic plague is transmitted by rodents, and there are a lot of them on this island. And even after hundreds of years, they can still carry this horrible disease. I think showing footage of the consequences of the disease is not the best idea. It's enough just to read the description of the symptoms. The bubonic plague is an acute infectious disease that proceeds in an extremely severe form. Patients suffer from fever. Their lymph nodes, internal organs, and lungs literally decay from the inside, and patients most often die from sepsis. Contracting it in the 18th century meant certain death and terrible agony. In general, everyone who ended up on the island was doomed. But in addition to mass burials, you can find an even more horrible place on the island. Bodies of plague victims were burned there. This is a separate part of Poveglia, where thousands of people died, and many of them were still alive. The fact is that nobody wanted to deal with the sick, let alone wait for their death. Some were killed on the spot, while others were burned alive. This part of the island is literally scattered with ash and human remains. Those who have been to this place claim that the soil really looks as if there was a huge fire. The soil is very dark and loose, and some claim that charred human remains still wash up on the shores of other islands from time to time. Some of them were sent to a laboratory for research, and the analysis showed that they were several hundred years old. It's scary to imagine the horrors that took place here. But fortunately, the plague was eventually defeated. The disease was eradicated thanks to the new treatment methods. But they didn't turn Poveglia Island into a resort, as they did with Venice. Instead, they opened a psychiatric hospital here. And rumor has it, people with the most severe cases of the disease were kept there, and the conditions they lived in scare me to the core. Essentially, it was a real concentration camp. Nobody intended to treat people suffering from schizophrenia, and the island remained a branch of hell on earth. Horrific experiments were conducted in the hospital. Physical torture was the norm, so people who ended up there were still doomed to die. Not only were they beaten, operated on without any anesthesia, and simply tortured, but they also underwent a series of psychological experiments. It's frightening to imagine what happened to the people who ended up there. From ordinary people suffering from hallucinations, or those suffering from delusions, they were turned into, excuse my crude expression, vegetables. In general, throughout its history, Poveglia Island continued to remain the hellish place where you wouldn't want even your worst enemy to end up. The hospital lasted for about 40 years, and then it was closed. After that, the island was used for growing agricultural crops. However, this didn't last long, and I think it was not the best idea. Growing wheat, like any other crop that then ended up on the shelves of large European stores, in the places where plague victims were buried, was a bad idea from the start. And since then, the island has been completely abandoned. Entry to it was officially closed. But some daredevils still visited the island by passing the bans, even in our time. And what they said about it shocks me. The sight of the abandoned island alone is horrifying. Half-collapsed buildings, rotting roofs gradually crumbling and falling onto the tiled floor, walls and shutters overgrown with ivy, and scattered iron beds from the psychiatric hospital. All of these scenes can evoke genuine horror. Everything is literally littered with traces of human activity. Besides the rusty hospital beds, you can see even more horrifying things. For example, in some rooms, surgical tables with instruments are still preserved. Perhaps they were once used to dissect people without anesthesia. And throughout the deafening silence, occasional creaks and rustles can be heard. Most likely, these eerie sounds in the oppressive atmosphere are made by the rodents, lizards, and millipedes that now inhabit the island. But some say they heard real screams of people. And this is despite the fact that there is not a single person on the island. It's frightening, isn't it? According to legend, during the plague outbreak, about 16,000 people disappeared from the island. Other sources claim that there were over 100,000 sick people. They were all left to die in agony without food and water. And even the remains of these poor people were not buried with honors. The island had real mass graves where people were thrown in like cattle. It is rumored that due to such horrors, there are still thousands of restless souls on the island. Apparently, this is why Poveglia is called the Haven of Ghosts. Although the locals deny all this, but I have a feeling that they are just calming the tourists down to make them spend more money. Why? Because the island is constantly patrolled by guards. Getting onto it is simply impossible. Apparently, the government is still hiding something from us, and only those lucky enough to sneak past the patrols could describe what was happening there. But why would they need to guard it? Naturally, I found some horrifying legends surrounding Poveglia Island. They say that the experiments conducted there were much worse than what I mentioned earlier. There was a truly insane doctor at work. For these experiments, he used a special tool. For instance, he performed trepanation on people while they were still conscious. And for this, a special drill was needed, resembling a regular corkscrew for wine bottles. He also performed lobotomies, which were used to treat mentally ill people. If you don't know, lobotomy is a method of brain manipulation. Iron spikes and rods were literally hammered through a person's eyes. Doctors believed that this damaged part of the brain where changes leading to mental illness occurred. So I wouldn't be surprised if this story was true. According to legend, this doctor conducted his experiments right on the bell tower. The screams of people were heard all over the island. Perhaps even now these restless souls are trying to communicate with us. According to legend, the doctor faced real retribution. According to some reports, he began to see the ghosts of his patients, and they drove him insane. One day he couldn't take it anymore and jumped from the roof of the bell tower, killing himself. While other sources claimed that it was an evil spirit that simply pushed the doctor off the roof. The scariest part is that the doctor didn't die immediately. A nurse who worked at the time claimed that after the fall, the man was still conscious, but some creature resembling a black shadow strangled him. And ever since, the soul of this horrible man has been wandering the island, searching for its new victims. I found reviews from people who still managed to visit this eerie place. And here's what they say. When a group of young guys approached the island by boat, their phones suddenly turned off. There was a funereal silence on the island, and only strange sounds came from the rooms of the former psychiatric hospital. There was a constant feeling of someone else's presence. The guys saw real shadows moving towards them. They whispered, "Leave this place." Some say that unknown entities could even touch and push them. And the last straw for the young and strong guys was when they heard a horrifying scream from the bell tower, as if someone was being cut alive. And there were only them on the island. And after the scream subsided, a ringing bell echoed in the silence, although it had been removed decades ago. The frightened guys hurried to leave the island. They struggled to start the boat's engine and sailed away, and they were tormented by real nightmares in their sleep. The souls of the deceased people there kept saying the same thing. "Why did you disturb me?" Many of them went insane. There is another story. In the 20th century, a wealthy family bought the island for a pittance. They planned to turn it into a summer residence, renovate the houses, tidy up the yards, plant beautiful plants and lawns. In short, turn this hellish place into a real paradise. And one day they all went to the island to inspect it as a family, and they had to stay overnight. The next day when they returned, their daughter's face was disfigured by an unknown creature. The girl had to have over 20 stitches. Doctors claimed that the girl's face was torn apart by fingers, and there were bite marks on her cheeks. All her relatives were immediately examined to understand who committed such a terrible crime, but no signs of violence were found from their side. The parents, like the girl, claimed that they saw and heard crying women and horrifying silhouettes of tortured people. This story was even written about in several popular Italian newspapers. Since then, no one wants to buy this island, and it remains abandoned. But perhaps this place will be open to visitors in a few years, if of course there are any. In 2014, the Italian government announced that they would hold an auction to lease the island for 99 years. This horrifying news disturbed literally everyone. Local residents who hide the horrifying truth argued against it, and people who have visited the island did everything possible to discourage the idea of handing over the island to anyone. The government plans to restore the buildings of the former psychiatric hospital and convert them into a hotel. And from the part of the island where tens of thousands of people were burned alive, they want to create a large garden. In general, it will be another place where people can relax. And I think if it weren't for the reputation of this sinister island, the idea would be a good one. Just think about it. A beautiful island in the middle of the bay, excellent nature, beautiful views of the city, peace and comfort, and of course, a private beach where no one would disturb you. It seems that Poveglia Island would become a real paradise. But in general, attempts to restore the island's infrastructure were already made in the 20th century. At that time, they wanted to renovate the buildings so that they could be used again for state purposes. But these restoration works were halted for unknown reasons. It is rumored that several workers disappeared without a trace, and those who managed to return claimed to hear strange sounds and see ghosts constantly terrorizing the builders. But personally, I would never stay in a hotel located on this island. There are too many frightening facts that I've already mentioned. Who knows, maybe all these ghosts, screams, and horrors that happen to people on the island are true. Would you like to spend the night in a room that used to be an operating room, where people were dissected alive and without anesthesia, or subjected to horrifying experiments? Write about it in the comments. In this video, I have told you all the facts and legends surrounding Poveglia Island. And personally, it seems to me that all this is actually true. Otherwise, a rich country like Italy would have long since restored the island and turned it into another resort. Thanks for watching.